Hi, I'm Allison. I'm an educator here at ANGELIC Organics Learning Center, and I'm also a vegetable farmer in Rockford, Illinois. So I'm really interested in talking to folks about how to eat local seasonal food. And particularly, I like talking to people about how to incorporate winter seasonal foods into our diet here somewhere in a northern cold climate. And so one thing that I talk to people about a lot is winter squash. When you get a winter squash whole from a farmer, it can be a little intimidating to deal with if you're not used to it. So today we're going to walk through what a winter squash is and how to process it in a way that feels not too scary, hopefully. All right, so first let's talk about what a winter squash is. Some people believe that a winter squash is a squash that grows in the winter, but actually winter squash and summer squash grow at the same time. And there are several different things that make them different from each other, but one of the main things that's important to us as people who are trying to eat locally is that winter squash are genetically more capable of growing a nice thick skin that is more difficult to damage and thus better at keeping pathogens out of the squash, pathogens that would cause the squash to spoil quickly. So like I was saying, some squash are just genetically better at creating a thick skin, but the other thing that influences how thick a squash's skin is how long we allow it to mature on the vine. So with summer squash, we tend to harvest them when they're really young and immature because we like the flavor better. But we could let them mature like we let a winter squash mature, and they would develop a thicker skin. But even so, the skins would still be thinner than a winter squash. So here we have two squash. This is an acorn squash, which is a winter squash, and a patty pan, which is a summer squash. I harvested both of these in around late August this year, which is at this point about 4 months ago. So you can see that both of them are still fine to eat. But if we look closer, we can see that the acorn squash is still completely blemish-free. And if we use a thumbnail and try to pierce the skin of the squash, we can see that there's a lot of resistance. Even pressing as hard as I can make like a little dent in the skin, but I can't really get through the skin. This is a winter squash, so it has a really nice tough skin that protects it. The patty pan, on the other hand, while we could still totally use this squash, is starting to look a little haggard after these long 4 months. We let it mature fully before we harvested it, which gave it a bit of a thick skin and protected it for this time, but we can see that it's starting to shrivel a little bit. There are some spots that are starting to maybe be colonized by some pathogens. And if we use our thumbnail to try to pierce the skin, we can see that I am in fact able to pierce through the skin with much less pressure than I was using on the acorn squash. So that's the difference between a winter squash and a summer squash, and it's why winter squash are a winter food staple if you're trying to eat locally in our climate. All right, so we know that the squash has a thick skin, the winter squash has a thick skin, which protects it, but that also makes it a little bit hard to cut into, which is what makes a winter squash intimidating. So this is my strategy. I like to make as few cuts as I can before I cook it, because when we cook the squash, its skin gets soft and it's easy to cut into. So even if a recipe that you're using calls for raw squash, I still like to use this procedure that I'm going to show you now. Okay, we're going to make just one cut into this squash before we put it in the oven to roast. On a squash like this that has lobes, we can use that to guide our knife. The lobe will help the knife from slipping around quite so much. But we also want to try to identify a place where the squash is going to rest fairly easily on the cutting board. If the squash that you have has a flat side, take advantage of that and put that against the cutting board. This one is pretty round and there's not really a good spot, so we're just going to do our best. We're going to identify a place where we can make the shortest possible cut that we can. Again, this is kind of a spear-shaped squash, so all of our cuts would be about the same. But if you had something like a butternut squash that has the long neck and then like a more bulbous bottom, you could cut across the neck where it's a shorter cut to make. Okay, so we're putting the knife in the little groove there, and we're going to rock back and forth a little bit. Instead of trying to like press straight down or like slice like you would slice an apple or something, we're gonna rock back and forth and let the knife like kind of lever its way through the squash. And now we're running into the stem a little bit, so we're just gonna gently pull the knife out and reposition a little bit and then go back to rocking back and forth. You might have just heard that it like cracked a little bit, which means that it's working. Knives are actually, you know, they're a simple machine, a wedge. And so basically what we're doing is we're letting the knife wedge the two halves of the squash apart. So again, just kind of rocking back and forth, rotating the squash as necessary. If we need to pull out the knife and reposition, we can totally do that, but we're making one cut like that. Now we've got our two halves, and we're going to put this in the oven. Well, we're going to scoop out the seeds first, and then we'll put it in the oven, even if your recipe calls for raw squash. Okay, so we're going to remove the pulp and seeds from this center section using just a regular spoon. We're removing them into a small mixing bowl. And the other half. All right, so at this point, these halves are ready to go on a baking sheet to kind of par cook before we process them. Now we're going to separate our seeds from the pulp, because you can also roast squash seeds. So to do that, I like to put some water in my bowl. And then sort of massage the seeds away from the pulp. We're just trying to get the big chunks of pulp out now. So this can be composted. Acorn squash are a particularly great kind of winter squash because they don't have very much pulp. Look at how much seed there is compared to pulp. And the reason to keep your squash seeds and eat them is because seeds are where plants store all of the energy they need to create a new plant in the spring. And so they've got a lot of nutrition in them, and like different kinds of nutrition than the rest of vegetable crops have. So it's a really good way to incorporate a more complete local food diet. Okay, so now we've removed the bigger chunks of pulp, and we're kind of filtering out smaller bits. We don't have to get out every last bit of pulp before we roast our seeds, but we want to try to get out most of it. If you're like me, you grew up eating roasted pumpkin seeds from when you carved pumpkins for Halloween. And I still do really like roasted pumpkin seeds as well, but as it turns out, pumpkin seeds have some of the toughest of all of the squash seeds. So if you've tried roasted pumpkin seeds and you found them a little bit unpleasant to chew, don't give up on squash seeds overall as a snack, because other ones, like the ones from acorn squash or butternut squash, are a lot more tender, and they're arguably better than pumpkin seeds that you might have had as a kid. All right, so at this point we've gotten most of the pulp out of here, and we can, we can just kind of strain the seeds out of the water and use a dish towel, a clean cotton dish towel, or paper towels if that's what you like to use in your kitchen, to dry them off. Drying makes them less likely to steam in the oven, so they'll have like a crispier texture instead of like kind of a chewy texture that they might have otherwise. This is another opportunity to pull out more pieces of pulp if you spot some. But this is what we're looking for, kind of dried off seeds, and that is what you would put on your sheet pan. You can choose to add a little bit of oil, salt, and pepper and roast them until they are toasted, just like barely brown. You'll want to watch them pretty closely because as they're getting close, they'll go from perfectly done to overdone pretty fast. So just keep an eye on them. Everybody's oven varies, but probably about 5 to 10 minutes is what you're going to need. All right, so back to our patty pan. If you do have a summer squash that you've hung on to and has made it a few months into the colder season, to prepare a summer squash, it shouldn't be all that difficult. It should be just like preparing a summer squash in the summer. You can see that it still has this thin skin that we can definitely eat if we want to, or if you did want to remove it, it should be really easy to remove with a knife or a vegetable peeler. It comes away super easily, unlike that acorn squash that we just saw. But with these fully mature summer squashes, what you'll notice is that they do have that big seed pocket with the bigger, more developed seeds like our acorn squash had. So if you are preparing a summer squash that is fully mature like this, whether it's a patty pan or a zucchini, you know, we've all gotten those big baseball bat zucchinis before, you can make it more enjoyable to eat by going ahead and scooping out the seed pocket the same way that we did for the acorn squash. All right, so just like with the acorn squash, we removed that inner seed pocket, which will make the mature summer squash a lot nicer to eat. Like I was mentioning earlier, the skin on a mature summer squash is tougher than it is on a young summer squash. So another way that we can make it more enjoyable to eat is to go ahead and peel off that outer skin. So kind of cutting into wedges, and then using our knife to go between the flesh of the squash. Very carefully, keep your fingers out of the way. The flesh of the squash and the skin. Like that. And after your acorn squash has roasted and kind of par cooked in the oven for a little while, it should be this easy to remove the skin from the outside of your acorn squash as it is to remove the skin from the outside of a summer squash that hasn't been cooked. So basically what we're doing when we par cook the acorn squash, the winter squash, is to make it handle like a mature summer squash instead of like a mature winter squash. So I'm gonna finish removing some of this skin. And then if I were going to use this summer squash in a recipe, I might want to cube it like this. Again, after you've par cooked your winter squash, it should be this easy to chop it into cubes. But you can see that if a recipe calls for raw winter squash, it's okay that you've par cooked it. This is still like not fully cooked. This texture, if it were the acorn squash instead, would still be kind of like raw squash. And so letting it cook in the recipe that called for raw squash wouldn't ruin it by any means. You might choose to cook it for a little less time than the recipe calls for, but even if you did cook it for the entire time that the recipe called for, it would be perfectly fine. All right, so as you've seen, there's not so much difference between a winter squash and a summer squash, and by understanding what makes them similar and different, you can prepare a winter squash confidently and without too much risk to your hands and well-being, hopefully. In our next video, we're going to show how to use a par-cooked winter squash to make a roasted sheet pan vegetable dish that will go on to be in our winter vegetable salad. So until next time, happy seasonal eating!